Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, after this very interesting and enlightening morning, I'm sure we will be even more enlightened this afternoon, because we have a very important topic, ecosystems and food systems valuing the connection. So bringing things together, that's very important. And I'm very happy that we will be speaking about some aspects which have been mentioned so far, but maybe we hear more in more depth about it. And then we can help to make the connection, not only among us, but between us and civil society. And I think that's the important point. And we have as a first speaker to give the keynote address, a good friend, Pavan Sukhdev. He is in Germany very well known, because when the Stern report was published, we were sitting in our office with our Minister of Environment, and he said, listen, everybody talks about environment now, why don't we have everybody talking about biodiversity? We need a similar report. And then we started looking around who could actually do that. And then we saw that somebody had published an important book that was, I think, in 2010-11, the book Cooperation 2020, and that was, at that time, the visiting fellow at Yale University, Pavan Sukhdev. And then we found out that before that, he had even been special advisor and head of the UNEP's Green Economy Initiative and was the lead author of the report towards the green economy. So who else was then the person to do the important report? He was an appointed lead of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and we are still trying to get action because of this very good report, and I hope, Pavan, you will give us another hint how we get really action going in the political arena. We welcome you.
I hope you've all enjoyed the sustainable food and stacked yourself on a lot of sustainable coffee. So, hint, hint. Thank you for the introduction, and today my task is to describe to you some of the issues that arise that are in common, in fact, between food and agriculture, not just in common in terms of flows from one to the other, impacts and dependencies, but common also in terms of thinking disciplines and planning and how do we organize solutions to another vast area of problems. As vast, I would say, as the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems, which was, of course, the topic of the TEEB report that you mentioned. From the TEEB report, I want to begin my story with just what I think is perhaps the most important message of this report, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and that has to do with the connection between rural poverty and ecosystems. And here's the way that we understood the problem, because ecosystem services, the goods and services that flow for free from nature to us, are basically a challenge because of their economic invisibility. No bee ever sent you an invoice. And yet, when you measure as a result of how much is the cost of bad bee ears versus good bee ears in terms of the value of fruit output around the world, then that answer is of the order of $200 billion. So you know what's the value of the services that the bees deliver without ever having received a single invoice from them. But this is just an example. There are many such examples of the economic invisibility of nature. And converting those examples into economics may sound banal, may sound even silly and immoral, but it is necessary because economics today is the language of policy. If you wish to communicate anything to policymakers with an end result in mind, choose economics, because that's the language that they understand. That's the reason why I went into this whole space and engaged myself as a study leader of TEEB. This example which I have for you here is basically about measuring ecosystem services and their values, and flood prevention, drought control, nutrients and freshwater flows, ecotourism, the whole jing-bang lot. And if we do that for countries such as Indonesia, India, and Brazil, we found that they were large, but not disturbingly large. In other words, in Indonesia, you could say that as a measure of value addition, there would be probably 20-odd%, 21% estimate of GDP. So there are missing elements which are not there in our normal thinking. Some of them are captured in a way, in an indirect way, because bee-based pollination means fruit is produced, which is sold, which is captured in GDP, but we don't know how much the value of that bee-based pollination is because nobody ever measured it, and so on. In India, it was 16%, in Brazil, 10%. That doesn't sound staggering, but the problem is we haven't posed the question correctly, because the question really should be, whose GDP? And if you do that, then you get a different perspective, because in fact, who suffers if the nutrients and fresh water from the forest through the aquifers to the fields of farmers don't happen? Well, obviously, it's the poor farmer who has to pay the price in terms of additional cost of irrigation or a decline in food output from his farms. Who suffers if the forests are not available to collect the fuel wood or any of the bushmeat and the goods that the forest provides for free? Well, it's the poor farmer's wife and family, because they don't have the means to cook and they don't have the means to get additional protein. Who suffers if the leaf litter from the forest isn't available? Well, it's again the poor farmer, because his cows and goats can't go into the forest to forage for leaf litter. So when we ask the question, having understood the problem more in detail, when we ask the question differently, not as, oh, what are ecosystem services as a fraction of missing GDP, but rather, what are ecosystem services consumed by poor households as a fraction of the GDP of the poor? That answer was surprisingly different. And that answer is for the 20 million in Brazil who gather nuts and forest products in northeastern parts of Brazil, in the Amazonas. That answer is more like 90%. For 100 million farmers in Indonesia, it's more like 75%. For the 350 million people in India who are dependent on either small-scale farming, sustainable or unsustainable, but they're basically subsistence farmers, and who are gatherers around the forests and fisher folk, local fisher folk, coastal communities, that answer is half, 47%. So ecosystem services are actually a huge part of the GDP of the poor. A lot of what comes to the poor comes to them. And then the question arises, well, the development strategies, the development policies, and the development plans of many developing countries do not seem to recognize this economic reality. So how can they be really development plans if, on the one hand, they're destroying the GDP of the poor, and on the other, replacing it with something else? And there are many dimensions to this something else. One is the employment dimension, because we are talking about large numbers. I mean, try, for instance, for the billion-odd farmers that I'm talking about, to convert them into Ferrari manufacturers, for instance. How practical is that as a development policy? And these are the issues that really come to the head when you do the economics correctly and holistically, which is the way that we would like it to be done, and which is the way that the TEEB project recommends it to be done. The final question that comes to mind is that if it is that obvious, and if there is so much research, then why doesn't this just happen? I mean, why don't all development plans focus their government investments in public policy, target the increase in the GDP of the poor, and focus on investment in conservation and forests and wetlands and all these wonderful things that I'm sure would gladden the hearts of many, including I'm a board member of CI, delighted that Peter Seligman is here. We'd all be very happy if this were just to happen, because it's understood that it makes good economic sense. But it doesn't just happen. And I've put in a lot of thought and research on understanding why, and I must tell you that why is this not happening? The answer is because it doesn't add to the profits of corporations. That is my conclusion, and it's one of the issues that I've dwelt upon in my book called Corporation 2020, which is the extent to which private profits have become a driver of almost every government policy around the world. And this is part of the challenge, I think, of what Guillermo, you referred this morning as dealing with food is all about dealing with systems and root causes. Well, here's a root cause that we need to worry about. It's the nature of today's corporation and what it does as a driver of policy and as a driver of outcomes in even food systems. Another project which was very much part of my recent life was something called the Green Economy Report, otherwise known as Towards the Green Economy. And this dealt with small farms and agriculture generally, but small farms particularly. And the reason that my co-authors, and we were, again, almost 500 of us there, chose to focus on the small farm is because we did believe that somehow today's discourse on agriculture did not give enough importance to the small farm. In fact, the discourse was too much geared towards, essentially seeds and fertilizers and pesticides. And to my thinking, it may have been that the discourse is almost captured by lobbies and by the industry, which is focused on seeds and fertilizers and pesticides. Because we hear a lot about GM versus non-GM crops and the issues around seeds and seed saving, and we hear a lot about intensive versus extensive farming and so on. But we don't hear enough about the importance of the small farm. But here are some statistics, including from Jules Pretty, whom I was delighted to find speaking this morning. So statistic number one, which has been mentioned this morning, was about 2.6 billion people rely on agricultural production systems for their livelihood. This is from an FAO report. And that represents more than 1 billion families. So this is the issue, that it's not only about food, it's about livelihoods. And many of these, of course, are poor families, so we can't merely ignore them. In terms of numbers, there are about 525 million farms around the world, out of which 400 million are less than just 2 hectares. That's small. That basically means that you are in subsistence farming of some kind, either that or in a rich country in hobby farming, but it's small. And those subsistence farms are actually accounting for something like 60% of the agricultural land on Earth, and a large part, probably close to half of the production. And the interesting thing about small farms is that because they represent poor families and poor rural households, because we need to focus on them for the 2 obvious reasons, that if we were able to increase the yields in small farms, we would be addressing 2 important problems. One is the problem of hunger, because very often distribution systems of food do not allow enough food to reach the areas where poverty is. And this is also areas of low farming and low output farming. And second, increase in yield in those small farms would mean more income in the hands of the poor, and therefore it is clearly a powerful solution towards poverty. In fact, some of the statistics that we put together on the report suggested that some of the best returns on investment, some of the best outcomes in terms of where you should focus for poverty reduction lies in this area of increasing the yield on small farms. Finally, another statistic, which is from Jules Pretty and from FAO, and I was delighted that both were represented in the sessions this morning, so well done, Patrick, on getting all of the right people into this room here. But these are really interesting statistics, which in the case of Jules's study, related to something like 287 sustainable farming schemes around the world, covering more than 50 developing countries and cutting across more than 12 million small farms of various kinds around the world. So it's a significant statistic. It's certainly statistically a large portion, something like 3% of the arable land in these areas. And his statistical result was that as a result of sustainable farming methods in these 287 schemes, on average, the yields increased by 79%. So that's 80% more food. Now, just do the arithmetic mentally, and this is easy. Let's say it's 80% times 50%. So potentially we could be growing by focusing on these sustainable farming methods, be they low tillage farming or no tillage farming, or recycling farm water, or using farm manure, or rotating crop species, or using different strains of the same crop to avoid pest losses, or finding small farm storage, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole range of things that can and have been done in all of these schemes. And the net result is that, yeah, if this model could be extended, this thinking could be extended around the world, we could be producing 40% more food as a result of higher yields here. And once again, what does that do? Well, 2 very simple things. Solves a lot of the poverty problem and solves a lot of the hunger problem. So you would think, obviously, every government must be focusing all its policies on investing in small farms, ensuring that they have access to these techniques and that they are completely enabled to do exactly that. Yes? No, of course not. So why does this not happen? Why is this not happening? And once again, I did a lot of thinking about this. I come to food as just a bemused and puzzled observer, because this is not naturally where my area is economics and externalities. But when I look at it, again, I find the answer to these problems is because sustainable small farm agriculture does not add to the profits of corporations. In fact, if you think about it, the use of less fertilizers and less pesticides and the non-dependence on marketed genetically modified seeds would actually probably decline the profits of corporations. And since in today's world, the corporations, by the way, just a little aside, which is for those who may not be familiar with the statistics, but in the US, 75% of GDP and jobs are private sector. Globally, it's more like 70 and 60%. Today's corporation is the single most important institution of our times. Apologies to any members of the Church of England and others who might think. But if they, because they are so important, it is no surprise that today's politician is beholden to the corporation. It is no surprise that today's politician, whose job is determined by getting ticks in the boxes of GDP growth, high employment, and balancing fiscal budgetary deficits, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly, funding campaigns. When you find the corporation is ticking all those 4 boxes, why should you not be listening to CEOs and looking over your shoulder all the time to the private profit impacts of your policies? And that's exactly what politicians do today. Today's politician, therefore, has become a follower, no longer a leader. The days of Mahatma Gandhi and Winston Churchill are long gone. Right? We are in a different world today. So here's the challenge, and I think this challenge is actually can be understood in terms of its impacts, and this is why I think so much in terms of externalities, because this challenge is one of private profits and public losses. And I illustrate this point to you, and apologies to the economists in the audience who don't need to be explained externalities, but here's an example for the others from South Thailand, which is actually from shrimp farming, so I think it's relevant to this audience. This study was done by Professor Ed Barbier and his team. He's an advisory board member of TEEB, apart from being a famous author on these issues of environmental economics. And they found that in South Thailand, the rush towards the conversion of mangrove swamps into shrimp farms was largely driven from a profit perspective. And here's the economics of it, which is that if you left the mangrove as it was, it would give you about $600 worth of value in fuel wood. Whereas if you convert it to a shrimp farm, and this is a period over 9 years, the value of that is about $9,600. But of course, you need to interrogate that result and see what about subsidies. And subsidies, as His Royal Highness also mentioned in his speech this morning, are an important area of concern for us. So in this case, if you take out the subsidies, the comparison is not that hot anymore. It's now $1,200 versus $600, but it's still in favor of the conversion of the mangrove swamp into the shrimp farm. However, when you start looking at ecosystem services and start valuing what nature delivers into society, then you get to evaluate things like storm protection and the fisheries. After all, mangroves are the nurseries of a lot of fish. And then you start, obviously, to putting values to those externalities, and you find they're huge and positive. So in fact, the mangrove's real value to society, the public benefits of the mangroves are more like 12,300 and not just 600. And if you work out the cost to society of restoring the land use for shrimp farming, basically because of salt and chemical deposition, it becomes unusable even for shrimp farming. So you need to restore that if you want to reuse it. So you need to factor in the cost of that. Well, that cost is an estimated $9,000. And when you've done all that, then the answer is, and this is the nub of my point, which is that it's no longer a question of looking at an unsustainable or an unprofitable option, which is keep the mangrove, but in fact, it is the profitable option. So depending on the lens that you use, whether the lens is one of private profits or the lens of public wealth, your answer, your trade-off, has a completely different answer. In one case, it is conversion. In the other case, conservation. Therein lies the challenge, but the bad news, I guess, from my side and from the research that's been done by TrueCost, and I believe Richard is somewhere here in the audience, the CEO of TrueCost. Yes? No? Yes, he is. There he is. So this result is from TrueCost, and they have been collecting data for the last 12 years on the externalities of corporations, the top 3,000 companies. When they surveyed and calculated their externalities in terms of greenhouse gases and water abstraction and so on, they found that totaled up to something like $2 trillion, which is almost 3.5% of global GDP. And I think Ken had mentioned this morning that the need for cheap food has led to a food system that's built on externalities, well, actually, many of these externalities are from the food sector. Now, one of the worrying points about these externalities is not just that they're big and that they represent private profits at the expense of public losses, but what exactly these externalities are. And I just highlight here 3 of them, which we are all familiar with: greenhouse gas emissions, water abstraction, and natural resource depletion. And if you look at planetary boundaries, in other words, the whole research done by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and you look at what's causing at least 6 of our planetary boundaries from being approached at a reckless pace, you will find the exact same externalities driving them. So it is very much about greenhouse gases driving both climate change and acidification, and about resource extraction being the cost of these externalities as well. The answer towards the solutions, if you like, are really in changing this agent of today's economy, the corporation. And there are, in my opinion, 4 important things that can be done. They have to do with accountable advertising. They have to do with reducing unlimited leverage, in other words, creating systems of limiting leverage, about resource taxation becoming the main form of taxation as against corporation tax, and, in my opinion, most importantly, about measuring and disclosing externalities. And the first steps towards this have been taken by the TEEB for Business Coalition in the report, again, commissioned by us, done by Trucost, which was about the top 100 externalities of business. Someone mentioned that it was coal-fired power in Eastern Asia, which was the largest, but the second largest was, and many of the other large ones, were agricultural externalities. And the one that's rather interesting here is cattle ranching and farming, which is a sector that generates about $17 billion worth of output, but its externalities are $350 billion. So it's 18 times as much as the value of the output. My friend Adam calls this whole thing dead animal arbitrage, and you can see why. But it is an amazing form of economic stupidity. We are soon going to explore this in more depth, but I'm not suggesting that our exploration, which is going to be called TEEB for Agriculture, to which I invite Patrick, you, and all of the people whom you've organized together for this conference. There's going to be a launch meeting to discuss what to have in this TEEB for Agriculture study, but essentially it's about studying the dependencies on nature of agricultural systems, the impacts on nature of our different agricultural systems, and making sure that in the process we create a good, solid body of evidence which policymakers can act upon and which is economically informed and economically expressed, because once again I emphasize that economics is the currency of policy. We will go into the science, of course. There is a little website here. If any of you wish to contact us, please feel free to do so, and you will definitely get an invitation to this launch meeting that's happening. We go in here very much in the TEEB spirit of open architecture. We invite people whom we know are relevant and interested. We do not go in with any predicated notion or ideas as to what exactly we shall study and so on. So this is very much an invitation to participate in a construction of a process and results of this kind. I close by saying that this is a very interesting time for us, and I think externalities, frankly, are the biggest free lunch in the history of this universe. I know we've had one just recently, but that was a small one. I hope that the small ones continue, but I do hope that we can stop the biggest free lunch in history. Thank you.